Bonsoir à
So, good
tous.
evening, everybody.
On va pouvoir
I
démarrer
think
ce
we can
webinaire.
start our webinar now.
Je pense qu'il y a assez de spectateurs
I
avec nous,
think
donc on
there's
commence.
quite a few
Euh,
people with us in the room now,
Bienvenue
so we're going to
dans cette
start.
deuxième rencontre de
Welcome to the
Conserverie
second
et
forum
CAROLLE
meeting of the
qui se tient
154 Fair,
actuellement à
which
Paris.
is currently being
Je
held in
m'appelle Laila
Paris.
Hida, je suis
I'm
la
LAILA
responsable
HIDA,
de
an
communication de
artist
cette
and
édition du
co-curator
forum
of this
qui s'appelle
edition of the
Lieu de
forum
travail
through
le
our
18
cultural
à
venue,
Marrakech.
Le 18 in
Cette
Marrakech.
édition, le 18,
For this
a été
edition,
initiée
Le
par
18 was
l'ONG pour
invited to
diffuser des
organise
messages
and
multiculturels.
commission the meetings.
En réponse à cette
We
invitation,
propose to
nous
do
avons
this
proposé des
in
thèmes à ces
collaboration with
possibilités
long-time
multimodales
contributors to
dans
our
notre espace
space,
pour reprendre
in line with the
ce thème
collaborative and
collectif
collective
et
way of doing
réflexif
things that
de notre
increasingly
organisation.
defines our
Pour cette
organisation.
occasion, nous avons décidé
We've
d'explorer une
decided to
question qui
explore an
dépasse les
issue
frontières,
that arises
dans
from the
laquelle on évolue
context in which
ici
we
au Maroc et
operate
aussi
here in
dans
Morocco,
d'autres
but
pays,
also elsewhere in other
c'est-à-dire
locations and
qui ouvre
contexts.
des perspectives de
This
pensée,
opens up different
d'agir,
perspectives for
de
thinking,
construire
doing,
en
acting, and building
collaboration,
through
en
collaboration,
adaptation, en écho,
conversations,
en
echoes,
formation,
and
en harmonie,
tension, in harmony with the
entre héritage et
context,
savoir.
heritage, and knowledge that precedes us.
Crafting words and
Crafting
worlds
words
for a
and
vernacular
worlds
economy of
for a
art est une
vernacular economy
proposition
of
pour
art
interroger des
is a
modes qui
proposal
sonnent
through which we
dans un moment
question the
où il
ways we
semble
do
crucial
things at a
de
time
se
when it
mettre
seems
en
crucial to
position,
refocus
se
on what we
concrétiser
are, what we
sur ce que
do,
nous voulons faire
and
avec nos
what we
sociétés
want to
à
do with
partir
our
de nos
societies
spécificités
based on
et
our
de
own
ne pas les arrêter sur
specificities,
celles
what makes us
de ce
socially, politically,
culturel et symbolique.
economically, culturally, and symbolically
Pour cette deuxième
unique.
rencontre, je suis
For this
particulièrement
second
attachée à
meeting, I
l'image
started with
et
my
à
own
l'évocative
experience and
photographie
photographic
qui a
practice,
évolué au
which
fil
has
des années.
evolved over the past
En
few
effet, depuis une
years.
quinzaine d'années,
Since
à travers
2015, I've been
l'édition
carrying out
de
research for
DELREZ,
an upcoming
nous
publication
renforçons
that
la
brings
production
together a large part of
photographique
my
et
photographic
documentaire,
production over the last
un
10
projet dans
years.
lequel j'ai
In this
décidé de
work,
me
I
rapprocher de
question
la
my
photographie
fundamental
moderne,
relationship with the
de ce que la
medium,
photographie
what
moderne
photography
peut
allows
apporter
me to
entre
portray
les lignes,
between the
en dehors du
lines,
cadre,
outside the
ce qui ne
frame,
se voit pas,
through what
en
cannot be
exhumant
seen,
une
by
archive
exhuming a
et une
personal
production
archive
parfois
which is
spontanée
sometimes
et parfois
spontaneous and
concertée.
sometimes premeditated.
Puis je me suis intéressée en
In
2019 à l'album de
2019, I
famille
became
Curated
interested in
par
family
Vernacular
albums
en
when I was
Marrakech,
involved in
avec
conducting a series of
de nombreuses
workshops
femmes
over the course of a
esthétiques
year with a group of
avec une
women who
fondation
frequent and collaborate with the
notamment
DELREZ
axée
Foundation,
sur la
which
promotion
focuses on promoting living
et
cultures
la
and
réhabilitation du
reactivating the
patrimoine
traditions and intangible
architectural de
heritage of the
Marrakech et
Medina
des
of
traditions culinaires de
Marrakech.
Marrakech. 11 femmes,
11
11
women,
albums,
11
11
albums,
séries d'histoires qui
11
ont inspiré
series
nos
of
émotions les plus
histories, and a
profondes,
project that
dans les
plunged us
souffrances les
into the
plus
depths of
intimes,
our most
dans les
intimate
joies
realms,
et les peines,
joys,
dans
sorrows,
l'invisible
the
et l'invisible.
visible and the invisible.
Ce projet que j'ai
This
nommé
project,
About
which I
Us
called
m'a
About
permis de
Us,
poser un
allowed
certain
me to
nombre de
ask a number
questions
of
sur la
questions
valeur,
about
la
value,
fonction et la
function, and
représentation des albums en
representation
famille,
in family
un
albums.
objet intime et
These
personnel
are intimate and personal objects which may
qui
have been on
représentent
display for
parfois
some
l'exception
time
et
and which
l'orthodoxie
go
de
against the more
l'art.
formal
Cette
foundations of
idée
photography and
me
art.
touche
Their aesthetics are
car elle
often
permet
poor, and this really resonates with me
d'explorer
personally.
le
They're
punctum,
filled with what
ce point
Barthes
de
calls the
tension, de
punctum,
désir
this point of
au-delà de
tension
ce
or
qui est
desire
visible.
beyond which is visible to the
Pour
eye.
m'accompagner dans cette
To
conversation,
accompany me
j'ai
in this
invité deux
conversation,
femmes,
I've invited two
deux
other
artistes
women,
photographes,
two
Carole
artists and
Benita
photographers,
et
Carole
Anne Delrez,
Benita and
également
Anne
photographe
DELREZ,
plein vol,
who's also
et
the
artiste
curator of a
collaboratrice.
venue.
Carole Benita est une
Carole
photographe
Benita is a
franco-marocaine qui
Franco-Moroccan
explore la
photographer
notion de
whose
mémoire
work
et de
explores the
famille et
notions of
d'histoire.
memory, family, and the
Elle
passage of
propose souvent
time.
à des
Carole
visiteurs
often
d'extraire
asks
des éléments de
handcrafted
signification
elements
familière
to old
à
family
l'aide de la
photos,
broderie,
such as
la peinture à
embroidery,
l'encre et le dessin à
beadwork, and
l'encre.
ink
Carole
drawings,
Benita
through
s'efforce de
which she strives
réinterpréter
to
sa propre histoire
reinterpret her own
de femme,
story as a
d'épouse et de famille.
daughter, wife, and
La
mother.
série
A
Photo-souvenirs,
photo
que
souvenir
l'on abordera
series that we'll
au cours
discuss
de la
during our
conversation,
conversation
est un
is
album de
based on a
famille
family
illustré
album of her own.
que l'on manipule
She
sur la
manipulates
toile
this,
avec du
working with
crayon,
needle and
avec du fil
threads,
et l'aiguille afin
to
d'en faire un
create an
album imaginaire
imaginary
qui
album
déconstruit le
that
mythe de la
deconstructs the
famille
myth of the
idéale.
ideal family.
Carole Benita est
Carole
représentée à
Benita
Marrakech par
is
l'atelier
represented in
127.
Marrakech by
Anne
Galerie
Delrez est
127.
photographe et depuis
And DELREZ is a photographer, and since 2009, she's been collecting, interviewing, and gathering testimonials focused on so called family photographic archives. Very early on, she introduced a reflection on the idea of poor imagery into her practice. Her discovery of a set of photographs of her great uncle and great aunt, Charles and Gabrielle, confirmed her interest in family photography and went on to inspire a book and an exhibition. The Conserverie is the venue she created in Metz, her city of origin. It's defined as the national conservatory of the family album, a somewhat subversive name for a project which is surely just as much to transmit these precious images to the public through different forms of exhibitions, workshops, and published books.
et d'édition de livres, avec un patrimoine
The
fort
Conserverie now has a
audiovisuel.
strong visual heritage of over 30,000 images and is
Donc ça, ça
recognized
serait
for
la
its work on
photographie.
vernacular photography.
Tout d'abord,
First of
avant de
all,
démarrer la
before
conversation
we
avec
start our
Thérèse sur la
conversation,
qualité, j'aimerais définir ce
Anne
qu'est la
and Carol,
photographie
I'd like to
bénitahe.
define what
Parce que
vernacular
sur
photography is. In
plusieurs
doing my
définitions
research,
existent.
several
Et en France, il
definitions
s'agirait d'une
emerged. We
photographie
could see these as
fonctionnelle et banale
functional and
sans
banal
artistique.
type of photography
La
without
photographie
artistic
vernacular est un
pretensions.
genre de
Vernacular
photographie
photography is a
classique
kind of amateur
où le sujet
photography
est la vie
whose
de tous
subject
les
is
jours.
everyday
C'est
life, like family
fictionnalisé, comme tu dis
photos.
ça.
But not
La
only this,
photographie
it's
est
a
sociale.
utilitarian
Ce sont
form
des
of
photos
photography,
qui montrent des scènes
like the photos in a
agréables,
newspaper or those used to
redistribuées.
illustrate
La photographie
advertisements.
vernaculaire aurait donc un
Its
but
aim,
précis,
then, is
me faire
precise,
s'ouvrir.
but it lies
J'ouvre les guillemets
outside
ce qui a
the
été
realm of
jugé
what's
et
been
diffusé
deemed most
comme
worthy of
artistique en
interest by the
France et
main bodies of
légitimation
cultural
culturelle.
legitimation.
Elle se développe
It's
en
developed on the
contre-plongée des
periphery
choses
of what's
qui se
referred to,
différencient
counts, and carries
intrinsèquement
weight within
d'un
the
style
artistic
artistique.
sphere,
Elle
the
est l'autre
other
vision
in
de
art.
l'imaginaire. C'est
This
une
is a
citation de
quotation
Clément
by
Chéreau,
Clément
historien de
Chéroux, a
photographie et
historian of
conservateur.
photography and a curator.
Alors, première question
So, the first
pour
question
Anne.
for Anne:
Est-ce que, Anne, tu serais
do you
d'accord
agree
sur
with what Clément Chéreau
selon Clément
says
Chéreau, de la photographie
in
vernaculaire?
terms
Est-ce que
of
c'est une
vernacular
photographie
photography?
qui
Is
pose
this the kind of
problème?
photography that poses a
On a du
problem?
mal à lui donner un
Is it
statut
hard to give it a
puisqu'elle appartient
status
à tout
because
le
it
monde,
belongs to
chacun a un
everyone and
statut
everyone has their own album?
Euh, alors, j'aime déjà
Yes,
merci pour la présentation
I'd
qui est
first like to thank you for your
passionnante.
introduction, which was really interesting.
J'éprouve une tendresse
Um,
particulière pour
when I
l'identité
heard
avec Clément
this
Chéreau,
quotation, I think it's a
qui
very
comprend en fait
interesting point
l'ensemble
of
de votre
view.
vie, puisqu'il a
When
été très
he's
attentif à
looked
vous,
at family
mais aussi avec
photographs
une
and he's
passion
had an
artistique
analytical
plutôt
um,
aimable de prime abord
way of
qui
seeing this,
surprend
but
en fait
also in
instantanément
terms
par
of
rapport au
what
entretien
it means for
que
other
vous
people.
initiez avec
I
ce
think
très
this is
beau texte.
important. It's
Alors,
almost we could make the link with iconography here.
je crois que votre question est dure comme
Your
entrée,
question is hard, actually, as a beginning
je crois que
question.
je suis
I think
d'accord,
I
et
do
notamment
agree,
parce
in a
qu'effectivement,
sense. I
euh,
believe that
les
this
attirances
kind of
qu'on va avoir
photography does
dans
indeed
ceux qui
belong to
fonctionnent en
people, and
résultat
people have their own
peut-être
thoughts
se font
about it.
forts,
And this
c'est
way of
pas à
thinking
cause de
might
la personne
actually
qui l'a
work at
regardé.
the
En fait, ça
same
dépend
time
parce qu'il y a
as
tant
other
de matière en fait
perspectives. Perhaps
artistique
when we're looking
qu'on
from the
a affaire à une
outside,
terminologie qui est
we might
propre à famille
associate family
photographique.
photography with another kind
Il y a
of
quelques années,
vocabulary.
on l'a poussée et l'appréhendée.
We perhaps have a
Donc
certain
votre
amount of
question
distance when we're
m'interpelle
looking at
volontiers.
it compared to
Tout à
those who
fait.
are looking
En fait, ce qui est
immediately at
spécifique
their own
justement,
photos.
ce que tu dis très
Just to
justement, c'est que
specify
finalement, c'est
slightly
quand on
more,
va
I think
poser
when we
Les
look
fonctions de la
at
photographie de
the
famille,
function
celle
of
avec laquelle
family
tu devrais
photographs, we can
faire la
perhaps
femme,
see this as
par ailleurs
photographs that
suppose
belong to an album,
une
photographs
fonction
that
particulière,
illustrate a
devient
specific
vernaculaire,
function.
à ce
It
moment-là, elle
becomes
prend une
they
autre
become
autonomie
vernacular,
et dans
and
ces cas-là,
at the
elle
time
peut
at
être
which they
choisie,
become vernacular, perhaps
elle
they
est
then take
réutilisée
on
et elle peut
another role.
aussi
They're perhaps
être
reused,
par des
reappropriated
conservateurs,
by,
des
for example,
curateurs, des personnes qui
artists
ont
or
fait quelque chose de
curators, individuals that are doing something
supérieur
else
et
with
c'est
these
ce qui va
photographs.
faire
Do
spécifiquement
you
la
feel that
différence
that
entre un
resonates with your
exemple
own
de photographie
experience?
qui est
Looking at this
bénitaire,
form of photography
et
that's
que ça.
perhaps been denigrated in a
alors,
certain
j'aurais
sense?
adoré que ça soit le modèle
Yes,
et en même temps,
I would.
c'est beaucoup plus simple que
I'd love to
ça.
be able to look at it in
Effectivement,
this
le
way. I
noir et
think
blanc
perhaps in a way for me
de la
it's more
fiction,
simple than that.
de la
Um,
reproduction,
It's to do with recognition, I think. I can't always take the photographs as a whole body of work. I sometimes come across a single image that I have to just take in isolation. So I think there are two ways of looking at them. You can look at them as individual photographs. You can look at the relationship they have with other photographs, both in aesthetic terms and in other terms within an album. Yes, so I think if I evoke the names of Charles and Gabrielle, this is perhaps interesting for you because this was the start of your photographic adventure in this particular area, wasn't it? Yes, so Charles and Gabrielle were my great uncle and aunt, and this really was an inspiration for me when I found these photographs. Now, we came across these photographs. My family was saying that we didn't necessarily need to keep them, we could get rid of them. But as an artist, I became very interested in them. So this was an inspiration to go into this particular line of photography. These were an interesting couple as well, Charles and Gabrielle, a couple that were in love, but who came across some barriers and certain consequences. And it was interesting to try to sort of look at their story and the way in which the photographs told their story, but had a certain universality to them. Um, it was very interesting for me to see this and to think about the context and the link to myself, as part of my family, culture, the way we look at others, etc. Was some of the themes that I wanted to explore with these particular photographs. I wanted to look at how photography could be used as a media to accompany emotion. It was a starting point for everything that I'm interested in now in terms of this type of photography. So I talk a lot about this.
That's perfect. That's a good transition on the use of photography. And let's move on to Carole. So Carole, you actually got your archive, or is that just a photo album? But I think you can clarify that later on. So Carole, you kind of manipulate this photography. And I actually would like to read one of the passages from one of your texts because it's actually very beautiful and I've got questions. So in one of your texts, you did say, and you did write that um, I choose photography conveying something that I've already seen, something familiar, happy moments that come from tales from my ancestors. And this happiness is ritualized and conveys here this family myth. And this is about this dark matter that is related to the family. What do you mean by this dark matter and what type of manipulation do you use on photography to use this dark matter to actually reinterpret your history? Hello everyone. So when I started photography, I started to document my own family. I started to kind of build an entire album. So, for example, I was documenting illness when someone was sick or a child alone, basically pictures that would not be usually in your family album. And when I started really with these family photos, growing older, I realized that, of course, family is your foundation. It's very important. And growing older, I realized that things are sometimes a lot more nuanced. It can sometimes be your foundation, but at the same time, it's also a limitation. In my own cultures, you can't really challenge tradition. You can't challenge family values. So I think it's very interesting to look at both sides. When I started to look into family photography, I think that looking at them, something else was coming up. I was like considering all the experience that I lived and also looking at the timeline between the moment when this photo was taken and 40 years later when I started to manipulate these photos. And I looked at what changed in the meantime. And when I used embroidery, for example, it was really a way to give a different version of the story. It was a way for me to be more fair. I don't mind this dark matter. What bothers me is when we try to evacuate, to eliminate this dark matter. And I think it's more about giving a more accurate image of the family. Embroidery was really a way to heal, you know, stitch after stitch. You're going to build something. So then it doesn't belong to me afterwards. Once it's done, it's just like I'm just a piece of this whole story. Indeed, you have this very visual aspect in your work. You do have a whole embroidery work in throughout your photos. But sometimes it's also like a way you're going to preserve your memory. That's what a family album is. And sometimes you select these moments. Of course, you act. Of course, you want to show that you're happy. So how do you kind of contradict this lie in your autobiography? And actually, Anne, you used also this same idea in one of your projects. Well, for me, embroidery was really a way to reintegrate these photos and this history, just to change the way I'm going to phrase these ideas. I think very simple. When I started doing that work, it's very important because when I do embroidery, you have to stitch. It's one stitch at the time. It's actually almost violent because, first of all, through this medium, there is a needle. So it's a kind of a way that you accommodate things, you build things. And also I wanted to use this medium of the perfect woman with using like this embroidery, which is this image of this perfect woman, which is also here showing a way that it's a way you can use it to have this dark matter reappear. And of course, the final, the outcome has to be seducing, has to be beautiful, but at the same time, it's kind of also here challenging because I use red. Red is the color of blood, is the color of sexuality. So I think everything was selected in my work, and the black is really a color I associate with anxiety. So all these colors have a meaning, and I think it's very important. And I'm not trying really to tell the truth because here again, it's very subjective. And here it's really about having a fair picture of a family and actually being able to find your own place in this family. And for you, Anne, based here on these comments from Carole, so she's done a whole work on a very like aesthetic way with embroidery, with stitching. I think it's almost a ritual. I'm interpreted that way. It's almost a healing ritual. It's almost like a therapy. I don't know, maybe I'm exaggerating here, Carole. But I also think that in your project and in La Conserverie, you use these same photographies coming from family albums, but you don't change them, right? You don't touch them, you don't manipulate them, and you don't select them either. So how do you work then with photographies, and how do you try to give another picture of this family to contradict this lie of the ideal family? I don't think I'm trying to contradict this lie. I can come back to that if you'd like, but these photographies, when I select some for an exhibition, I'm going to select a corpus of pictures to illustrate an idea. I will select these photographies, but I'm just going to, clean them and erase the time, really. Erase the time between when the picture was taken and when I decided to use this picture. So it's just a technical gesture, really, just cleaning any dust from the pictures. And I am not here interested in what this picture means to me, does it mean, but more on really the vision of the photographer at the time, and that's very important. And I think the photographer and of course the model in the photo, it's a kind of a link between both. So this selection, oh, a nice cat passing by.
Je fais peu de sélection.
So really, when it comes to selection, I think it's rather limited. And I do not select these photographies because it's also about being intellectually honest, just also to respect people giving us these photographies. I think they give us these photos for different reasons. Most of the time, I would say that it's more related to their own history, to their own memory. And these are photos that, yes, have a meaning, have several, layers of history. And when they arrived here, they just become images for me. And then we are going to activate some images by selecting them, and some of the photos we'll never actually looked at. We're just going to digitalize them, and that's it. Whereas some other photos will be used all the time, so activated all the time. So coming back to that lie, I think it's pretty obvious that it's a huge, social lie. That's what photography is, but like that's what painting was. Because when you present something, is of course you do the best with what you have. Actually, before here, this Zoom, you know what I did? I actually wanted to do something with my hair to look pretty, right? And that's what it means being together. You want to look beautiful or handsome. That's the game. And here in photography, that means, of course, a lie. That means this dark matter, as Carol very well said. But I do not work on my own family. Here again, these photographies are far away from me. So this lie, I find it very sweet, actually, because it's not my family, my lie. So I take everything, including lies, everything. I take it all. So I wonder, as a photographer, how can you actually stop, taking pictures? Because that's really a question. Because for me, that's kind of challenging, isn't it, as a photographer? Because you've got this work at La Conserverie, you look at other people's photographies. So your own project as an artist is dedicated here to the La Conserverie and recovering these photo albums and the digitalization, archiving of these photos. Is that easier? Is that easier to work on photos that are not your photos? Is like a kind of distance between you, your emotions, and the content of these images? I would like it to be that way, exactly the way you described, but that's not easy. For example, an exhibition that I prepared like 2 days ago. So this is an exhibition called Light, Kitchen and Landscape. It's a kind of like a list. It's a very cold title. However, I try to create this distance with this title, but actually, I also wanted to call it Mrs. Pomerg, I love you. And Mrs. Pomerg is actually, she's the lady who donated these photos. And because these photos like mean so much for me, they're just amazing photos. And of course, I couldn't call this exhibition that way. I'm not a historian, I'm just an artist, and I need to create this distance with my emotions. And that's how I did it, using this title, colder title. But I'm still don't fully understand why am I doing this project. And I understand that this is a lifetime project. I will continue throughout my life to look at archives of the other people's photographies. And I'm jealous of this family. I'm jealous of these families. Really, I am. But I understand it's not easy. And I understand that here, all these photos that I look through, like I have an example of a family here where this dad must have done like thousands of photos of his kids. And I can totally imagine the kids being fed up with all this. But, you know, I envy them. I'm jealous. That is very interesting because I think we're not all equal towards photography and our own personal archives and family photos. When I worked on our project about us, I realized, working with all these women, that we had very different albums, very different stories. And through this project of the foundation, Dar Belage, that was very interesting. And Carole, I have a question for you. You have a series called I Will Never Forget You. So how in this series of photos, how did you use these feelings? So there's something missing and you were kind of looking at your grandparents and ancestors, and you look at other photos, like anonymous photos, to recreate the story? Yes, I actually started to collect like photos that I buy, you know, in like secondhand shops and the charity shops, and I'm very attracted to photos. I mean, I think it's fascinating the way they trigger totally different feelings. It's completely different emotion. And I feel very emotional because we're talking about people who have a story, who have disappeared nowadays. They're like ghosts. And I think this is fascinating, and I've got boxes and boxes of these photos. And this is when I started to work on this series of photos where I started to collect all these images going to my parents, my sisters. I actually realized that there was very few photos of my parents before their wedding. And my parents were born in the 30s in Morocco. And of course, at that time, there was no water or electricity. So, of course, no photography. That was quite normal.
My grandma had a few photos, but for personal reasons, I didn't have access to these. So there was a kind of need really for this family memory. I think my parents moved a lot, and there were very few photos. I had a few of my maternal grandma, but not very many at all. So when I was looking at different photos that I actually managed to find bit by bit, I kind of put together this lost memory. For me, this work was a process that I kind of needed to go through. Um, and I didn't recognize the individuals in the photographs, but it was something that I wanted to actually look at in terms of anonymity. I used gold leaf to actually mask all the faces. So the idea was to really portray these individuals as anonymous people. This it was a work where I was sort of discovering how these memories were forged, but also taking away the individual in them. This allowed me to kind of put links together when it came to my own family history and sort of work on what I had in my mind as well and in my imagination to put together a history, to give it a new existence. The idea of actually piercing through the paper with a needle and putting this gold leaf onto the photographs. The two are quite different ways of working, but I'd like to sort of ask you to compare those in terms of your artistic method. Well, I don't apply the same process systematically. I think a lot about exactly how I want to work on the photographs. It's a very conscious process for me. I I think about what I want to really interrogate when it comes to each photograph and what I feel is the best way of working on them. It's an experiment, really. I try different methods and see what works best in each context. It's a very evaluative process. I'm looking at what actually speaks to me when it comes to each body of work. I'd like to now go back to something that Carol said when she talked about intuition. Anne, I think you would maybe be able to say something on this as well. It's an interesting idea. When we think about the Conserverie as a project, I find the name really interesting, actually. You call it the National Conservatory or Archives almost of a family album or family albums. And it's an interesting name, I think, because it's not so much archiving, but it's sort of showing these photos to the public and also reappropriating them and questioning them as an art form. Is that right? Yes, yes. It's interesting to hear you say this. I thought it was something fairly amusing as well to sort of think about. The idea was to also question what it means to actually archive something and the authority at stake here as well. How do we decide what is being kept or archived? What traces do we want to leave behind and how do we retain these? I mean, we talk about documents and actually archiving documents as a political choice. I think it is a political notion here, and I wanted to question this and think about this in relation to family albums. What do we keep also as families or as individuals in terms of our history? And how is this linked to what we keep as a national history? So, when it comes to having national archives, do these have to be big things or can they be little things that belong to individuals? I think it is right and proper to keep records of individual families and individual photographs like this. And how do you operate then within this National Archives setup, if you like? How does it work exactly? We talked about how many images you now have, 30,000. How does it work? How do you get these images? Do people donate them? What do you do when you receive them? How does it work? Yep, there are now 35,000, in fact, and I am the main individual working on this. It's pretty much my own project. So I put together exhibitions. I work individually as a mediator. I'm not very good at communication, though. I'm not really a comms person, so I don't really work on that. But I have had some press reviews, and when articles come out or TV programs, I often get a lot of contact from people, lots of requests, etc., in the weeks afterwards. So families come and they say, "Oh, would you be interested in this?" And I think now people are passing the message around, and I've actually had some contact with um, retirement homes as well, and I've had some donations from people through that. Sorry, I've forgotten your question now, Leila. Sorry, I was just asking that about what you do exactly when you receive photographs. You want to digitalize them, you keep them. We have different strata, if you like, different types of photographs that we receive as well. People might give us a huge body of work or a huge body of photographs and albums, or it might be just very limited. So it depends on the particular project that I'm working on. I do make a certain selection. There are a few images I might perhaps discard because it's the same. There are two images that are pretty much identical, but I don't actually put very many aside. I tend to keep nearly everything. So when it comes to actually digitalizing these and putting them into the file, writing down the numbers, etc., I try to include all the relevant ones, and I keep them here in an archive process. It's a sort of thesaurus that I've set up. So it's a documentary process, and so that individuals, if they want to actually come into the conservatory and actually consult a particular image, they will be able to actually look it up, and they'll be able to access the image. They might be able to do this descriptively or through a title. The idea is to really not only create a space for artists, but also for the public. I mean, artists are very interested in the space, and it's probably majority artists, but also for the public. This leads me to another question, I think, for both of you now. When you work on albums, I think the history of a family is not only written in each specific event, but in this accumulation of collections of images. So, for example, Anne, when you receive a body of photography, there are many, many things that might also be interpreted outside of the photographs themselves. How does this interpretive process work? How does it take place for you, Anne? There's something very interesting when I receive images. I think one really strong emotion for me is that there's a real smell to the albums. It's a sensory thing for me. When I actually smell this scent, I think about what's happened to the photographs, whether or not the albums were within a family home or whether they were in more of a museum setting before they came to me. So I can actually detect the different smells, the smell of the paper, the smell of whether or not it's something that's been stored, put away out of sight, or is it something that was very much in the home itself, perhaps in the kitchen, let's say. This is something I find very interesting. I've been very receptive to these smells. There are individuals also who perhaps try to direct the way in which I interpret the photographs. They perhaps give me more information. Other people just kind of don't look at the photographs. They give them to me without really making any kind of comment, without really wanting to go into them. So this is perhaps very interesting in terms of showing the relationship between those who are giving me the photographs and perhaps those who took the photos, those who are in the photos. There are very different contexts at play here. Some individuals come to me with their photos and they actually almost list them for me and they talk about them. I don't necessarily take this on board as something that's very interesting to me. Somebody might say, oh, this is my grandma, she was born in X and X place, etc. But for me, this is not really my area. I'm not a genealogist. This is not something that I'm particularly interested in. But they want to give me this information. It's important for them. Carole, have you got anything to add to this idea? Yes, absolutely. For me, when it comes to my own family photographs, I was actually not allowed to sort of go through them and touch them when I was younger. It's something that my photographs in my particular family were kind of kept, almost as archives. Something we didn't really manipulate or touch. So this is interesting in terms of thinking about whether or not they're very present in the home or not. And when I try to consider the albums themselves, for me, it's interesting in terms of my own context, what I could and couldn't use and have access to. When I actually buy photographs or come across photographs, I keep everything. I don't like discarding, throwing away people's photographs. For me, it really is a memory of somebody who really existed, and I don't feel that it's my role to throw this away. I try to keep everything. We don't take photographs in the same way today as we did in the past. This is also very interesting. When we talk about archives or family albums, we often think about old films and photographs and slides, photographs that were very much older style photographs on film and photographic paper. What do you think now in terms of digital photography? Do you consider this as part of your work at the moment? The change now in the digital world, the way that people take photographs? Yes, I think there are two questions here. To answer the most simple of the two, I don't actually accept digital photos at the moment. It's for a very simple issue. When we actually get these images on material, on photographic paper, it really is something tangible. It's something that you can reflect on, you can hold, you can look at, you can display in a different way. If it's a digital file and you're printing off a copy, I think it's quite a different process. I do a lot of indexing work as part of my project, and I think at the moment I haven't gone into the digital realm yet. When people come to me with the photographs, it's more in terms of the actual physical photographs. It's something that I perhaps need to think about. People have actually offered me digital photos, and I think sometimes people think about the digital photos being perhaps better quality, or I'm thinking about it, but at the moment it's very much the physical realm. In terms of digital photography, I haven't really had a response that I've worked on yet. And when I think about digital photography, I don't think there's necessarily a huge difference in terms of the way of taking photos. And I think that the link with the social networks has changed the realm of photography a lot. But in terms of an actual media, digital photography is perhaps the same as the old style photography. Not photography for social media, but when we're thinking about family photos in that sense, I think perhaps the aesthetics are quite similar to how we thought about them perhaps 80 years or so ago. When I looked at the website for this platform, there were categories used to define and to also research the different areas. How does this work? How do you actually categorize the photographs? How do you choose how to put photographs into categories? Black and white, birthday, individuals and their specific poses, etc. How does it work? Animals.
So first of all, of course, you look at the elements of the photography. It's also part of the selection. But the idea is really, I am not the one deciding what is significant or not. So I always give a maximum of tools because these images will be shared. So I provide a maximum of entry points so that everyone can then find what they need. So of course, black and white or color. Some people don't like color photos. Some prefer black and white. So it's really a first level analysis. It's a very simplistic one. And then it's also my personal opinion, and also using some words that are, for example, there's a keyword like beautiful pictures. I mean, it doesn't really mean much, but actually it's helpful to me. Therefore, I think I use it also as a category. I use it in my back office because then in beautiful pictures, there are pictures that are even more beautiful than just beautiful. And that's also my artistic project. And sometimes I categorize them and then I realize that this was a mistake and I go back and change them. And that's very interesting. Like there is a category, as you know, that is like funny. Well, funny is actually very subjective. And, what can be funny for me is not necessarily funny for you. Carole? What about you? What about this choice in the picture? So you don't always use all the pictures in your archives, in your family albums. So do you select some specific moments? Are those moments that you want to specifically explore? So do you know exactly what you want, or it's something that comes to you along the way? So when you look at your own personal album, but also when you look at just random pictures. In my personal album, I've done this work for the other photos, same thing. But in parallel, I always have like new projects, and that's what I'm fascinated about. I still continue. I have a digital camera, like everybody, I guess. I use my iPhone all the time. And during actually this lockdown period, I think there was a really the time when I was starting to think, what am I going to do with these photos? I actually have the beginning of a new series. Like you start taking photos and slowly compile them. You take a lot of photos. We actually take photos of about everything because your iPhone is now a notepad and we never print them. We never print these photos. So they are somewhere. It's like a type of memory, but we never print these photos. So there will be a whole work, you know, that I'm preparing. So I'm working on it. So all these challenges, I just try to order everything at some point when I'm ready. So does that challenge our relationship with photography? You've mentioned now the number of photos. There is a kind of acceleration of the pictures. And you said that we were taking about the same photos before than today. We're trying to have like beautiful pictures, but we definitely take more pictures and also more pictures of one single moment. So instead of just taking one photo, we're just going to take 10 photos of one model or one moment. So working on the archives, is that the way to kind of be like a resistance, applying a resistance to this change, to this shift in photography? No, not at all. I don't think I'm made for resisting anything really, but I think I think it's still possible to really, you know, leave and have these same values and sharing. I receive a lot of schools here, so young people using, of course, social media, and I show them albums and old photos, and it's actually not very difficult to make this link and to show them how you can use photography to talk about yourself and talk about your own situation and your ego as an adolescent. It's about the same thing as, when photography started. So very quickly, we kind of forget that there's a lot of ups, but also a lot of downs. And it's the same thing. It's like the 50s or the 60s. We always used photography in that way, more than actually another medium. So it's a tool, and it's a tool that we use, but it's a tool that can be artistic, but it's a tool that we use. It's a utility. It's one of the technologies that is the most useful. I understand that I did not answer to your question. I'm sorry. No, it's fine. It's totally fine. I think it's challenging for me too. So that's perfect. And I love your ideas. So this tool, it's also a tool that we use to tell stories, to have a so it's a work. So you can actually tell different stories with one single photo. You can say a lot with one photo. Carole, is that what you do? So when you use your photography, your artistic side, is that the way you tell a personal story? Or is just a way to try to be more objective, more fair? I think it's more a way to tell things. So if I could write, maybe if I was writing better, I would have been a writer, It's just a way you express things. And I don't think I can use any other medium. And the manipulation is, yes, to readjust the image of the world. And my reality to some extent. It's not the reality, it's my reality. It is about a representation of my world. It's beautiful. It's beautiful representation of your world. What about you, Anne? So you mentioned that you work with young people where you were telling these young people to tell a lie through photography.
C'est
How does that
majoritairement des
work?
jeunes, mais ça s'est fait
Well,
aussi
it
avec
works with
des
everyone actually, not only with the
ce que je veux dire,
young
peut-être les
people, with
aînés, avec
adults
des
as
valeurs
well.
dans le
So
sens,
it is
avec
a
des
workshop
comptes
called
6 ans, et
Autobiography with a
il faut
Lie.
qu'ils,
It works with like
ils trouvent une
6-year-olds
photo
and it
importante sur
works with
lesquelles à
adults.
choisir
So they can't select a
et
photo. I'm just giving them a
on
photo.
parle de photographie avant,
And of
on
course,
parle
we
de
talk prior to
conception de
that about
Marrakech, ces photos-là,
photography,
pourquoi
and
elles
I
sont
explain
importantes,
why this is my work and why I try to archive these photos and
et je
why
les
I'm doing
aide
that. But then I tell them, lie to.
à projeter de eux dans cette
So
photographie.
you have
Et
to
mon
use
but
this
aussi dans
photography
ce
in your
livre, finalement,
own
c'est que je pense
story.
qu'il y a eu 700 textes,
And
600 ou
I
700
think
textes
there's been
écrits.
like 600 or
C'est vraiment ça
700
ce qui est très bien
texts,
écrit.
I think,
C'est-à-dire
written, like
tous les
writing
éléments
about this lie.
nécessaires
And every single
pour
person
avoir
I've
l'air
put in that
crédible, à
position,
réussir à avoir envie.
everyone
Et
came up
donc,
with
en fait,
something.
ils se saisissent de
So
cette
this is
image et
fascinating.
ils écrivent
They
dessus.
use this photo and
Ça part
immediately something comes
sur un
up.
usage, bien
So
évidemment.
of course, it takes sometimes a little more
C'est un
time,
strate de la
and
photographie
sometimes it
et
goes
une
to different
pratique
levels,
essentielle. La
really.
photographie étant importante,
But
à mon
still,
sens,
it's
pour que
beautiful to
les
think about this
pédagogies
lie. And
professionnelles
because it's a
puissent
lie, well, you can add, you can go
meilleur
beyond all the
exploitation.
limitations. And that's fascinating to see how children love it. So I think it's very funny also to talk about your imagination here and to include imagination. And that's fantastic to link this imagination with photography. But to lie, it's also funny because it's also the way you look at things. So this project will then be
Ça
edited.
s'appelle
I think there's
autobiographiquement
several books.
ensemble
Yes,
et
absolutely. There's a book called An
ils sont des 300
Autobiography of a Lie.
de cette
And I think
série.
it's about the
Ça sera pas là non plus,
258
c'est pas
first
exclusivement des
texts. So
textes
here
que j'ai
again,
écrits.
I mean, I'm not selecting
C'est un peu
anything.
un principe
Every
de
single
pratique
text
que j'ai
uh, that
écrit
was
avec
written
la
in this
sélection.
workshop is included in the book, no selection. So the photos come from your
Non,
archives.
non, c'est celles qui ne sont pas archivées.
So
Ce
these
sont
are photos that are
celles qui tirent aussi.
that have
C'est-à-dire
not
que
been archived yet.
tire au hasard dans mes boîtes des photos.
So it's just like you have my
Ce qui est quand
boxes
même
with all the
beaucoup
photos
plus
and they
agréable
pick one.
que de faire semblant de tirer au hasard
So
sur
that's
un mécono. Il
quite
n'y a pas de tiers.
interesting. There's material here. There's
Je
something to
travaille avec
touch,
un
something to look,
photographe
and they
génial,
leave
Maurice,
with
qui est
this
incroyable.
photo. So they leave with the original photo. So I've just
Mais de
digitalized the photo, and it's a kind of exchange. I keep the
Emmanuel,
text and they keep
merci
the
Emmanuel
photo.
Fructus,
And
qui
same thing with
est
Emmanuel
à
Fructus.
Marrakech,
She's a wonderful lady. We had also a
dit
workshop with her
en série
here
scolaire, je sors mes
because
caisses,
when we have children,
elles
I
peuvent
take
choisir
all
une
the
photo.
boxes out with all the photos,
Et
and
avec
they can
la
pick one.
recommande de pas mal d'enseignants dans le
And
secteur
it's
scolaire, et
also
là, ils se
always
rendent
very
compte
surprising for
qu'il
teachers to
le font.
realize that these
Ils
young
choisissent les
people,
photos, ils sont
they
amenés à
really
choisir la
love
photo
it.
de
They
cette personne.
can
C'est absolument
actually pick a picture of someone that they have no clue about. They don't know these people. So I think we've got 3 minutes left. So let me just remind everyone that if you have questions, you have the opportunity to do so. So let me check if we have some questions here. I see some very good comments. Thank you very much. For me, it's been a pleasure, really, Anne and Carole. I love this discussion. And I just would like to mention something before we conclude. And I don't know if this is really a desire to write. You often have like some text, and I see that on your platform in the edition of the book. So writing, is that important for you? Is writing another type of photography? Is writing something that goes along your photography? At the very beginning, I started writing to kind of clarify my thoughts, just to give me a direction, to be more specific about my topics. And then all along, I started to realize that I was writing something more personal that was entirely part of my work, such as, for example, the impossible expectations that I'm embroidering and some souvenirs, and I create a small book, a small album, and then we place those in boxes, and like a memory that I keep somewhere. And in a series called I Will Never Forgive You, a book was published. And there I added some more writing because I wanted like old, like, you know, traditional old albums. If you look at those, most people were actually writing something, you know, at the bottom of the page, like a souvenir of a beautiful evening outside in the garden. And I wanted to recreate this atmosphere. Actually, to counterbalance this lie, I made a selection of a different text on a very negative emotions. So I used the keyboard. So the text was completely a keyboard that was a damaged keyboard. So it was very hard to understand. But I tried to counterbalance this idea of ideal too much like preparation. So it was like the other, it's kind of the other side of the story. So you've got the photo and then this text, which is very difficult to read. So both sides of the story, and the fact that I worked on this damaged keyboard. Well, the souvenir is actually very difficult to read through. We're not sure what it is, and I like to play on these relationship. And I'm also working on other ideas at the moment on the more literary work. I'm very interested, and I don't want to limit myself to a medium. So if I want to use one medium, I will do so. And if I want to use another one, that's what I will do. So it's just like another layer, that's all. So it's not only about photography. There's not only photography in my life. I'm also interested in other mediums. So that's what matters really. So it can be photography, it can be writing, ceramics, it can be engraving. I try to be as free as I can.
There's an amazing coherency in your work, Carole. It's really interesting to see your new productions each time because there is something very, very manual in terms of what you're producing. We can see it as a writing, but it's something, you know, with the embroidery as well. It comes together as a sort of drawing process on the photographs, and everything is linked together through this manual work. So is this something interesting for you and important for you to work with your hands in that way? Yes, yeah, it's important for me. It's hard for me to explain, but I come from fashion actually. My former career was in the fashion world, so I am very much steeped in this world of couture, of sewing, and as I said, it's linked to the idea of the ideal woman as well. You know, a woman who's sewing. It's something that also takes time. You know, sewing and creating an image in this way is a timely process. And even when I'm taking a photo with my iPhone, I do actually take a lot of time. It's something I like to, you know, really take time over. So the notion of time is an important thing for me as well. Embroidery, as I say, it's linked to the work of women, this idea of stereotypical perfect women, and the role of women is something that I like to look into as well, and to sort of say something about that. It's a way of getting my point across. And trying to actually build up a discourse through the tools I have at my disposal, a needle and thread. I hope that's answered the question. Yes, it's perfect. It's a really interesting way of concluding as well. I think subversive is perhaps an interesting word to use here. How can we exist and continue our creative process in a subversive way? And you chose to create your own venue where you appropriated and gathered all these things that came to you through other individuals. And when you put together exhibitions as a curator, you're a sort of mediator, looking at these images and the texts. You write as well, don't you? Write texts for your exhibitions. I'm just trying to see here. I think I actually have a text. I put it to one side here, but it's magnificent for Madame Pinel. So you said, could I read a few lines from it? So the text as a curator that you actually put together. So you say, this photographic ensemble could have been presented under the title Madame Pimer or Family, or Madame Pimer, I Love You. And then you put two ... points. Its title is Lumière, Cuisine, Regard et Paysage. So light, kitchen, landscape, and it's a way of looking at an iconographic form, something extraordinary within an ordinary context. This text really is beautiful, so I think it would be something interesting for our listeners to look at on the platform. I'd like to conclude, I think, with that, if there are no further questions. I'd like to thank you once again, Carole and Anne. We really can feel your passion coming through. It was a great pleasure for me to converse with you. I hope next time we can do this face to face. Thanks very much for the invitation. It was a real pleasure for me to be part of this conversation with you. Thank you. Thanks very much. I'd like to also thank the organization team for 154 for giving me the opportunity to lead this conversation. Thank the forum, particularly Olivia Peterson, for her support. I'd like to also invite you, in the name of my team and Le 18, for our next forum in February. And until then, I wish you a good night and please remain undisciplined.